So thank you all for coming tonight. Karen Duville and I'm Jennifer Davey are part of Linking Lands Alliance, this grassroots organization that's sponsoring the talk tonight. And the maps that you see around the room are part of our project, which is to help teach us and landowners in the Upper Valley about how wide-ranging the habitat for animals is and how we should try to think of our land as part of a bigger whole and what we might do on our land to help animals that need great big parcels to live on, what we can do to help that work better for them. So we'd love to talk with people about their land or about their towns and where they think the habitat is. And we've had a lot of fun with our local groups getting together. So if anybody's interested in those sort of local grassroots kind of gatherings, we have sign-up sheets and you can talk to us afterwards too. And the other display here is Vermont Coverts, which is another organization that's statewide that has workshops that train people about how to manage their land for wildlife. And they're a lot of fun. They're 3 days. You learn a lot about not only wildlife, but also silviculture, which is what you can do with cutting trees that helps animals. So if you want to know about either of those groups, talk to either of us and we can fill you in on that. Tonight we're lucky enough to have Forrest Hammond talk about bear. And he's from the Fish and Wildlife Department. And he's from Vermont originally, but he went to school. He's going to stand up and try to intro. But he went to school in Wyoming, so he spent a lot of time studying grizzly bear and black bear, so he has a lot of great information. And his work deals with both moose and bear, but he's going to talk about bear tonight, and you will learn a great deal. I've heard him speak, and this is a wonderful talk. So, without further ado.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. Thank you. My name is Forrest Hammond. I work for the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. We've got a presentation of about an hour, the bears of Vermont. I like to stress quite a bit people's interactions with bears and how you can actually play a role with bears. This is the time of year when the breeding season is starting with bears, and the bears that have had yearling bears with them, the females are starting to kick them off, and they're finding the way in the world right now. And those are the ones that are most apt to show up in your backyards right now. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the life cycle of bears and about how we interact with them. Because certainly black bears we view as an umbrella species. If we can protect black bear, we can protect habitat for most of our forest-dwelling species. And it takes a little more effort with bears than with some of the other species. If you go to the next slide, please. We have a little technical difficulty here, so our clicker we found didn't work. It's probably a matter of weak batteries or something, so we're actually going to do it more manually. In the past, black bears were a fairly rare species in the state. If you talk with your parents or your grandparents, it was quite a thrill to see a bear, and they most often saw one either in the deep woods, perhaps hunting, or at times the dump sites that different towns had would attract bears, and people would actually go at night to hang out and actually in the hopes of seeing a bear coming into the dumps. And that was most often seen. Now, we have a different type of bear, and I really think that some of the, probably you're more often going to see bear in Vermont now looking out your living room window, coming across your yard, especially if you've still got a bird feeder out. It may be coming as well as the garbage, or just checking out your backyard to see if you have any food. It might have received food down the lane a little bit, and it's checking other houses now as well to see if there are other human foods. So this is actually a very common occurrence. This slide was sent to me by someone. Email is a wonderful thing now, and I don't always write down who I receive slides from, so if you see one of your slides in here, it very well could be. I'm sorry I didn't acknowledge you, but I borrow a great number of slides now through the internet, and also people provide slides and share slides, and so you might see one of your slides actually. We're talking about the American black bear, the eastern black bear. Interesting enough, our black bear here in the east of the Mississippi, is a bear that's primarily black. And it makes sense with a black bear, right? I only say that because black bears west of the Mississippi in the Rocky Mountains of the west Black bears are just as apt to be a brown color, a red, or even a blonde color. But here, they are jet black, with the only other color being brown on their nose. Young bears on the tips of the ears have brown as well. And probably a third to a quarter of the bears also have a white crescent on their chest as well. In Vermont, our bear actually tends to be a smaller bear than many other places that have bears. And it also tends overall to be a more wary animal. Bears are a product of their environment and also about how they interact with people. And we have a relatively long hunting season for bear, helps keep them wary. It's actually, we've got an inconsistent food sources, natural foods for bears as well. So our bears just don't tend to get as large as bears do in many other parts of their range across North America, where black bears often will get 2 or 3 times the size of our bears. An adult male tends to be somewhere around 250 pounds in the state, give or take 50 pounds or as much as 100 pounds, and usually a female is about half of that. The average female bear that we've got, adult female, probably weighs somewhere around 150 to 180 pounds. And they're very slow to grow and mature. And it all depends on how much food and what the food conditions have been like. Often, if we've had late frost and not many berries or nuts, a bear might be age 5 or 6 before it matures enough to have the first cubs. In better habitat, females can actually breed at age 2 and produce at age 3. That doesn't happen very, very often in Vermont, just because we have such inconsistent food source. So we have a small, wary bear compared to most places that bears occur in surrounding states and regions across the country. Next. Vermont's land history limited the number of bears that we had. At one time, Vermont, of course, was forested very heavily. We probably had large numbers of bears. There were more nut species than we have now, probably, more mature trees. We also had probably Atlantic salmon running in the rivers and streams. It was a food source. There were probably pretty large numbers of bears. They declined fairly fast with settlement of Vermont, mostly because of the clearing of the land and because that they were a food source for very early settlers. They were much sought after for their pelts and for the fat as well. It was used a lot by the early settlers. Probably helped some of our first colonists actually make it through the winter if they were able to kill a few bears. And as they cleared the land, and especially when they brought in different domestic livestock and chickens and turkeys and had cornfields, suddenly the bears were seen as a nuisance, as a predator on these, and as a varmint, and they were certainly killed at will and as much as they could. Plus they removed the habitat. So by the 1900 or so, 1850, 1900, we probably had very few bears or hardly any at all in the state. In fact, there are accounts from some towns, records of bears being observed and the whole town turning out to drive those woods to try to kill that bear that they thought was a threat to their livestock, to their sheep and stuff like that. There just weren't very many at all. And probably the earliest hunters of bears were our Native Americans. They were probably the most effective at hunting bears during the winter time. Bears are quite vulnerable in their dens. And without a doubt, that's probably when the Native Americans took the most bears. They probably actively searched for bear dens and then just surrounded the site, and the bear is quite vulnerable, and they probably took quite a few bears during the winter time. And it was a time when the Native Americans probably needed the meat the most as well as a food source. Yes. And there was a bounty right up until 1945 on bears. So not only did we view them as a varmint where they could be killed indiscriminately, we promoted it and paid hard cash. The states paid hard cash to actually kill bears. They would, at a time when hard cash was very hard to come by, they still had bounties on bears, as they did some other species as well, including porcupines and rattlesnakes and such things as that. Next, please. Hunting continues in the state. We do have a legacy of hunting. It's something handed down from family to family, especially. There are some families that continue to like to hunt bears and to eat bear meat and see it as a source of meat. We're not sure exactly how many bear hunters we have in the state. We're making effort to find out now. With our early season last year, it was the first year where you actually had to buy a tag to hunt prior to the deer season for bear. We had 10,500 people actually buy tags, which was a surprise to me that we actually had that many bear hunters in the state. We have a population of approximately 6,000 bears in the state. This is a number that over the past 20 years we allowed to double, approximately double in the state. And when we allowed the population to double, prior to this, bears had occurred mostly in just the mountainous regions of the state. And when the population doubled, they spilled over to almost every town outside of the islands in the state. Now we can find bears, including here in Norwich and Hartford and Heartland and Springfield and Windsor. These towns didn't used to have bears when I was growing up at all. And now every year, bears actually have females with cubs in these towns. We know the bears have established themselves in these areas. So we do have regulated hunting in the state. It's very closely controlled. There are more regulations on the hunting of bears than there are on the hunting of deer in the state. There are actually more regulations with that. So it's very closely regulated. And with that, we actually have allowed the population to grow. We actually want it to stabilize about where it is now. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. Next, please. One of the aspects of hunting, the state does allow the hunting, the use of hounds as well. We do not allow baiting as some states do. If you have both baiting and hounds, it's almost like too effective a way to hunt. But with hounds alone, they take usually about 10 to 12% of the harvest each year is taken with the use of hounds. Hounds serves a role as well. When there's a nuisance bear in the area where there's some conflict, sometimes the local warden will bring in a houndsman to try to do some hazing of that bear, to try to move it away from an area where it's causing a problem. So it's actively used with management as well. And again, they're very closely regulated as well. Next, please. What we find is our harvest changes year to year in the state. And again, it's all based on food. Everything about bears is about food. And 2012 was a year there was very little food. We tend to cycle. It seems like roughly every other year there are many berries and nuts for the animals out there. 2012 was a year that perhaps you remember, we had just no berries and no nuts. And we found the distribution of the harvest changed. The darker the color, the higher number of harvests for that town, with Pownell actually having the highest. They had 19 bears taken in Pownell. And the reason why Pownell had so many bears taken was because there were so few natural foods. The bears moved out of the mountains. Pretty much the central part of the state was the core bear range where we've had the highest numbers of bears in the past. But when there's no nuts and berries, the bears have to go somewhere to find it. And so what we found is there's actually more agriculture on the boundary towns in the state. As we know, it's the lower elevation areas, and especially towns where there were many cornfields. That was the primary food in September for bears. It was during the hunting season, 2012, and quite a few bears were taken along the Connecticut River and then along the border with New York State as well. Next slide, please. We all are products of our food. We're always searching for food. Bears more so, simply because for 5 months of the year, they're not eating at all. And during that time period, the females are producing their cubs and lactating. And everything with bear society depends on their size. And they need to get enough food during those other 8 months or 7 months to reproduce, as well as build up the size to be somebody in bear society. And so they're always searching for food and looking for it. And they travel great distances. They need large acreages. And that's part of the reason we talk about them being an umbrella species. They need large amounts of forested area to meet their life needs, especially because the food that they're seeking every year occurs in different amounts, and different foods are abundant or not abundant. And so a bear, usually its home range is not sufficient for all of its dietary needs. It has to go outside of there to find foods, at least on an every other year basis. Next, please. And as I mentioned earlier, Vermont and even New Hampshire, northern New England, does not have a lot of key foods. Although bears will eat just about anything we will and more, there are several key species that are very important to them. And these are the ones in Vermont that are probably the most important, with actually beech nuts at the bottom actually being the most important. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But as you can see, in looking at these key species that occur late in the summer and during the fall, it's only agricultural corn, feed corn, that is probably consistent at all. The rest of these, some years we have some years we don't. Next. One key food that's missing in most bear range is this plant right here. Who knows what that plant is? Yeah, skunk cabbage. Anytime you read about bears' spring food, they talk about skunk cabbage. In most parts of bear range, of course, North America, there is skunk cabbage where bears occur. And it's a key food, and they actually do very well in the spring with skunk cabbage. Not only can they sustain their weight, but perhaps even gain weight eating skunk cabbage, and it comes up very early. Unfortunately, when I first started studying bears in Vermont, I found that in most of the high elevation regions with the core bear habitat, we don't have skunk cabbage in those areas. We have it around Lake Champlain. We have it where the Deerfield River enters into Massachusetts. We have it over toward the western part toward Lake Champlain, but most of the towns have very little. There's some other plants that people mistake for that. Most importantly, probably false hellebore. It comes up as a light green plant very early, and people think that's skunk cabbage. Bears do very well on this. Where it occurs, it just doesn't occur very much. It does just across our border in Massachusetts, and every wetland in Connecticut seems to be just full of skunk cabbage. And the people that study bears for there say that even if there are overwintering nuts available, the bears will often be eating skunk cabbage instead, and they do very well. Unfortunately, we just don't have much in Vermont. I think it's one of the key reasons our bears are actually smaller and have lower reproductive rates is a lot of it's due to the lack of this one plant. Next, please. This is another key summer food, and it's often why bears will come near rich soils that are near roads and near houses as well. You recognize this as the fruiting jack in the pulpit, and bears will actually dig up the corn and eat it, even though it's something we can't eat. The kidneys would actually break down trying to eat this. It's very, very bitter, very difficult. This is what it looks like in early May, in April and early May for bears wandering around in our forest. There's just almost no food. There's nothing green yet, and it's very few things for them to eat. And it's a time that they term walking starvation for bears almost, unless there's been a really good nut production the previous fall of beech nuts. The years that we have lots of acorns, usually the acorns fall early. All the different animal species eat the acorns up pretty much before springtime. But beech nuts occur late in the year, drop late, get covered with snow, and usually available this time of year. And we had a really good beech crop in 2011, and we had it again last fall. And so this spring and the spring of 2012, that's what the bears were feeding. One thing that makes management of bears very difficult is they're just so darn intelligent. They like to eat the same foods we do. They're easily habituated, means just they lose their fear of people, and they're attracted to human foods and become food conditioned. They really seek those out as much as possible, and they're good at getting them. Go ahead and click through those. We've got several. Bears will find a way to get food if they know they're there. Stay there. And We'll talk a little bit more about bird feeders and bears. It's just such a key issue, especially with the young bears. They will all at one time or another approach houses and actually try to get food. Luckily, Vermont's still a rural enough state that most Vermonters still tend to take things into hands enough that it'll give the bear a negative experience. The worst thing you can do is just sit back and let the bear get the seeds from the bird feeder, get your garbage, and just watch it or take pictures through your window and allow it to happen. I'll speak a little bit about beech trees and the importance of beech nuts. When I first returned from college and returned to Vermont, and I met with Vermont's bear biologist at the time, Charlie Willey, who wrote the book on bears in Vermont at the time. He told me then, he said, beech nuts are the most important food for bears in the state. And it's years that we have beech nuts produced that winter the females tend to synchronize and produce cubs. And it's pretty complicated how they do it. But a large part of it is if they don't have beech nuts and that next spring, after the cubs are born, when they come out of the dens, they go to the beech stands, the overwintering nuts, if there's none on the ground, then the female has a tough time getting enough food to produce enough milk. And often her cubs will just die. Or they'll be so weak that she just they can't keep up with her, and they're easily predated on by coyotes or bobcats or fisher and that type of thing. And so she loses her cubs, breeds again that summer, and then if there are nuts that year, then in the spring the cubs survive better because she's able to lactate, produce more milk. And so that's a way that they synchronize to years that most of the females that are going to have cubs, the cubs are born and survive following years of beech nut production. And it's hard to believe that a little tiny nut, go ahead next, can be just so important, or that these areas of concentrated trees can be so important. But the bears like to feed on beech nuts, on ridge tops, remote areas, because they're often climbing the trees to get the nuts early in the season before they drop. And they're very vulnerable and feel exposed, so they don't do it near roads and near people. And they tend to do this in remote area. And to be most efficient, they go to where there are a lot of mature trees, a high density beech trees. We call these bear-scarred beech stands, and we actually try to protect these. We can tell that that's what they are because all the claw marks on the bark of these trees. Next, please. And beech nuts, again, it's this little tiny nut at the top that's so important to bears. And it's a very sweet nut if you haven't eaten it. It's got a high amount of fat. And the way the bears can gain weight on this, and they do, is to go to these areas where there are a lot of trees, there are a lot of nuts in those areas. And because the actually nuts produce in a kind of a thorny husk, and then there's two nuts with a very hard shell, rather than trying to crack those shells like they do with acorns to eat the meat, they just eat it shell and all. Just to eat it all, let their system digest and go through it. And that's how they can eat enough of these in a fast amount of time. You'd think it'd be pretty rough on their digestive system and stuff with all those shells, but they actually do that. This time of year, you can go into these beech stands and find all these dry piles of shells. And that's the remains of fecal matter from this past year, and all that's left is the dry shells. And it's funny because I'll walk through these stands with people, and I'll point those out, and they don't even recognize what that is. It's just a pile of shells everywhere, and that's actually. And the important thing about beech nuts is the bears can continue to eat them, and they get a lot of nutritive value even as they're growing at this time of year. That the bears are still eating them. They're pretty much tapering off probably about now. They're getting large enough that there just aren't as many. That's something that it just shows that the value of this nut isn't just in the fall, but right through the fall and spring. Next, please. When you go into these beech stands, one way you can tell what they are is there's actually these large, what look like large squirrel nests, as much as 10 feet across up in the beech trees, where they break the branches and pull them into the forks of the trees and lay back and actually strip the nuts off and eat them while up in the trees. And again, to do that, they're not comfortable unless they're in a pretty remote area. Even hiking trails and things like that, You would think you're way up in the woods, the bear would do it right next to hiking trails, but they tend to even try to get away from those where they just won't be disturbed, less chance of people coming by. Next. And that's enough probably on beach at this time. I just get very enthusiastic about it because it's just so important to the bears in Vermont. And we actually protect these, and I've been in a lot of different hearings with Act 250 and 248 where developers don't want to have to protect these and stuff like that, explaining the importance of these. And what the difference it makes is how much food they can get, how consistent, as to when the female, again, at what age she first produces young, how many young she produces, and whether or not her young actually survive or not. It's all based on that food. It's a really difficult life for bears trying to survive and get through that. Next, please. So we feel there are a lot of challenges to managing bears. Next slide, please. One thing that Vermont has been very good at, we probably lead the nation, is protecting bear habitat. Especially when our bears were mostly in our least populous towns, where we had the fewest number of people, high elevation towns for the center of the state, we had a small number of bears. We tried to protect all that core habitat, and when Act 250 started in the 1970s, one of the first things we did along with deer wintering areas was try to protect these areas that were most important to the bears. Most states don't do that with black bears, and you hear comments in other states saying, you know, bears are a common species, why do you protect habitat for them, and things like that. We just think that there are so few alternative foods that we do, and we try to work as well through Act 250 in promoting unfragmented habitats. The bears do need large areas with food. Next, please. And with Act 250, besides the scarred beach stands, travel corridors and linkage habitat. Because the bears have to travel to find their foods outside the home ranges, and they tend to go in the same type of areas. It's forested habitat, and they cross roads in the same areas. We can actually define those, and in some cases we protected those through Act 250 as well. And then bear wetlands, where in the spring and summer, it's often where the first wetland species of the first green plants that the bears feed on, and also they need them for cooling in the summer. So where we identify wetlands used a lot by bears, in some cases we try to conserve or protect those if we're able to as well. Next, please. We've done some research in the state as well. We looked at resort development in the late 1980s and 1990s, at what the needs of developers of the big ski resorts were. At one time, our ski areas were just ski areas, but starting in the late 1970s, we had large corporations buy our ski areas for the most part and want to do four-season resorts, and residential development was a huge part of all these resorts. And so suddenly there started to be a lot of impacts on bears. So we actually did some work in the late 1980s and 90s looking at what the needs are of the bears in relation to these areas. And we found that indeed resort development and bears can coexist, but first you identify what's the most important for the bears and what the needs of the resort are. And we developed a template for the ski areas based on that study, where a master plan would be developed on what the needs of bears were, what the plans of the resort were, and to make them mesh. And that was first done in Stratton, and most of the ski areas now have done that. This is a map that shows some of the largest forest blocks in the state, and it also just happens to be the areas that we had our early populations of bears, where after the Vermont became reforested, where we had the largest numbers of bears. And right up until approximately 1990 or so, these were the areas where almost all of our bears were found. But then we started a management planning process. We went out to the public, and the public indicated we'd actually like to see more bears in the state. So we backed off with the hunting seasons. We shortened the hunting season and allowed the population to grow, and now we've got bears where we have them now in the state. Pretty much all the towns. Next, please. We also looked at whether or not we had just one population of bears or whether or not genetically we had different populations. And what we found was we share a population of bears with Massachusetts, where the genetic makeup is mostly like that. The blue in the center of the state, the bears tend to be genetic makeup pretty much the same, and there was a fairly distinct one in the Northeast Kingdom. And we think how this came about was perhaps because it takes, of course, decades and decades to see any kind of genetic changes. But we think with the clearing of our valleys and stuff, it was just the mountain regions that the bears lived, and there were wide spaces where there weren't many trees and there wasn't much crossover with bears. And now we have some of our major highways in those areas, and those tend to be semi-permeable barriers to bears as well. What we find is some of the male bears cross, but we don't have many of the female bears crossing our major roads. And we see that with looking at the automobile collision data on bears, especially for the interstate system and some of our major highways, where the males are twice as likely to be killed on the roads as the female, more than twice as likely. And some of the challenges are bears like to cause problems in the search of food. Certainly beekeepers have had a rough time in the state, and they're not real happy about the spread of bears throughout the state because most of the towns didn't have many bears and didn't get visited, and the beekeepers didn't get visited much outside of those mountainous towns. And now almost every town in the state, if you're going to raise bees, you have to use electric fencing. It is effective with bears, but it's an extra cost and more work for beekeepers. Next, please. Corn is a very complex issue as well for bears because I'm not sure bears really see it as a human food. Often it's adjacent to a forested area and a bear can just walk right out of the woods into a cornfield and voila, it's the largest amount of highly nutritious food that a bear actually can come on. But interesting enough, the bears do know that they feed on corn at risk. No farmer likes their corn to be visited by bears and fed. Bears will actually live inside a cornfield and press it all down, core it out. You might not be able to tell from the outside of the field, but when a farmer goes to cut the field, you just find wide areas, just all beaten down, and the corn's no good to them at all. And that can be a problem. And the farmer then ends up inviting his friends and calling people, trying to get rid of those bears, come kill the bears. You know, there's drivers with his trucks carrying rifles with them and things like that. The bears are intelligent enough. They've learned that even though this is a wonderful food source, it comes at a risk. And the bears don't go to cornfields every year. It's the years where the berries and nuts are in short supply that the bears feel forced to go into these areas. And in a year that we do have berries and nuts, even though that's more widely dispersed, it's not as concentrated as a food source as corn is, they stick to the wild foods and they're not in those cornfields much during those years. So they know it comes at a risk to go into cornfields. Next, please. This is kind of what it looks like from an aerial view. You can see they just get inside those in bears. We've had stories as going through a cornfield, as many as 13 bears come running out, and they stay right there once they get there. And it's just such a wonderful food source for them, but it makes it really vulnerable because suddenly they're in a small area and hunters can come and people actually trying to get the bears and out of there. That's good. And it's so easy to get human foods for some bears if they visit. Most people don't even put lids on their garbage, you know, when you put it out on the curb and things like that. You can certainly do other things with garbage, discourage bears. One, don't put it out the night before, but put it out the morning, you know there's going to be a pickup. You can have lids on your garbage cans. You can get a stronger structure garbage can where you actually put a lid on and actually put some hinges on it, where you can put clasps on it so a bear can't open it very easily. There are different things you can do as well. And you may have to do that. If bears learn when garbage pickup day is. You have to do it. We have a lot of records of that, of bears coming back to a certain area the day that they know there'll be garbage out. Next please. And even where we work with residential subdivisions, as Act 250 permits, it calls for them having a dumpster that's bear-proof. people get into a rush, or the weekend folks, they don't realize there's a bear problem, they're too lazy to put their garbage inside the dumpster, and the bear continues to get human foods. And as I say, once they get human foods in one place, they go somewhere else, and the more that they get human foods and get away with it, the more their behavior progresses and they become more brazen. And then they'll try to get into a garage to get at food, or they'll try to get in someone's kitchen when they smell something good cooking in there. At that point, they start causing actual damage that comes at a cost, and we get calls and all that. And once they start going inside buildings, and the way people are most often hurt by bears, and it's reported as bear charges, is there'll be a bear in a garage or inside a building or something, and someone will just show up and it blocks the bear's route out. And running over that person, scrambling to get out, the bear might claw them several times or even give them a bite or two. And that usually goes down as a charge. And almost every year in this part of New England, we'll hear something about it on TV. It makes the news from the Adirondacks or New Hampshire, Vermont. We've had them in Vermont as well. You think about it, this is a 200-pound bear or something. It could very easily, it's got all the equipment, it could kill a person very easily if it wanted to. We don't have reports of bears killing people. Instead, it's more these encounters like that, where someone gets one bite or some scratches or something like that. They really try to avoid people, except they're drawn to the human foods, and that can be a problem. And often, when a bear reaches that point where he's trying human foods that much, then often the bear ends up having an untimely end. One of the bigger problems as well is that people who intentionally feed bears because they think it's really neat to show their neighbors that they've got bears and stuff like that. And it's kind of interesting because this is really easy to draw bears. Anybody could do this if you want to, just by feeding them a lot of marshmallows and things like that, having them out there for them. The bears will act tamed. They'll do a lot to get that food. But even this person, obviously it's had some problems. This thing that's red on a pole right there is a very highly charged cattle prod. And so he's prepared for a bear perhaps not being so happy. And one reason bears get unhappy when they're fed is when you run out of food. Or if a bear shows up after the others have been fed. And so most of the places that I've gone to that have been feeding bears, you can tell there, because often their lower doors and windows have fencing across them, and there's claw marks on the side of their houses and stuff like that. And these people are actually the most at risk of anywhere. There's been cases across the country, different states, where people actually in these situations have been killed by their bears. And again, all it takes is running out of food just a little bit too soon. This is one case. This is a photo shared from Minnesota. This person felt he nearly raised this bear. He had it named. He fed it marshmallows. It came every day. One day he ran out of marshmallows a little bit too soon, as the next slide will show. And it nearly tore his arm off and sent this person to the hospital. They're not domestic animals at all. They do quite well in the woods. They can survive there just fine, and they don't need our food. And when they get our food, even if we like providing it for them and seeing that bear, our neighbor might not like being surprised on her porch, or the person 4 miles away from the same bear because it's still going house to house looking for food. And often someone will take matters in their own hands, shoot it with a .22, and they'll run off wounded to die later, or get hit by a car. Being in a residential area, they're not good at crossing roads and stuff. And again, one of the first things that a young bear is attracted to is birdseed. They have such acute senses of smell. They can probably smell black suet and black oil sunflower seeds from 1 mile or 2 miles away. And at this time of year, there's nothing they can find in the wood that has a nutritive value and stuff as a couple pounds of black oil sunflower seeds. So it's very attractive to them, and they'll try to overcome risks to do it. And what we encourage people to do is first, if you know especially that you're prone in an area to have bears in your neighborhood, take those bird feeders down. And if a bear might be in your neighborhood, you should think about a plan for what you're going to do if one shows up in your yard. Don't just watch it, but actually make some noise, be a little bit aggressive, let it know it's not wanted in your backyard. And it might just alter its behavior enough that it will go back to the woods instead of keep trying to get human foods. Next, please. Again, suet, it must have a powerful odor. I'm sure they can get it from a huge distance away. This again, just looking at this bear, this is these young male bears that are 16 or 17 months of age, right about now. They've left their mother, they've been kicked out, they're trying to find a home range of their own, but they're so small in bear society that if it's good bear range, they're not allowed to stay there. Their mother does let the female young stay in her home range, but not the males. And so the males will travel a great distance, and they're looking desperately for food, and they can smell human foods. And the first time they probably come in at night very cautiously into someone's backyard. If there's no negative experience, they'll come during the day, they'll get more brazen. Soon they're on your deck, licking your grill, looking for dog food, and that type of thing. This is a young male. You can tell it's a young one. Look at the size of the ears in proportion. It looks long, lanky, long legs, very skinny build. A big bear looks real blocky. It has very short ears in proportion to its head. Next, please. And again, they don't cross roads well. And coming around houses, they often get hit as they're traveling. Again, you tell this is a lanky young bear traveling this time of year. We've actually got one that you'll probably see in the news soon. We're actually going to do a press release in the next couple days. We've got a red ear tag bear that's come up from Connecticut. We even know which bear it is because it's a numbered one. And so far it's gone through 5 different towns in the southeastern part of the state. And it's gone from backyard to backyard to backyard. We get a call from every person saying, come get your bear, or we've got your ear tag bear in our yard. And it's very friendly. It actually denned with its mother underneath someone's deck in Simsbury, Connecticut, I think, this past year. And again, it's off traveling, and it's coming through Vermont. It's very habituated and looking for human foods. It hasn't caused any damage yet, but it's going from house to house to house, and we're getting dozens of calls on this. And so we're going to do a press release asking people to help us with this bear, see if we can modify its behaviors, encourage people to clean up any attractants around their house in these towns, and see if they plan, if the bear comes in your backyard, give it a negative experience. Hit it with paintballs or a slingshot, something shot from a slingshot, let off an air horn, or even one person I talked with this morning, the woman said, yeah, it came walking across this little bridge on her lawn, across this little thing, and she came walking up to the house. I stepped out and hollered to it. It looked at me and left. She let it be known it wasn't wanted on her property, and the bear just left. And I said, you did exactly right in that case. So we don't, the thing is, if that bear doesn't change its behavior, it probably won't live to be 2 years of age. And that's why we're using this bear to showcase how you can actually alter a bear's behavior by our actions and make them survive. Next, please. And of course, the linkage habitat, especially the road crossings, we identify a lot of these by where bears get killed and where they're sighted the most. And we work with the transportation department on vegetation management. If there's ever, in a lot of these main roads, when they go from 2 lanes to 4, there's actually federal transportation funds available perhaps for a crossing structure. And so we're collecting this data around the state. A lot of towns and organizations are helping us collect this kind of data on bear crossings, just so we'll have it when highways go to larger highways and there's opportunities for structures to help the animals get across the road. Next, please. Even sugar lots, bears can cause problems. Well, probably still squirrels cause more problems than bears do, but it just shows you there are challenges. We get calls even in sugar lots with bear damage. And again, these young bears that are causing problems now, primarily these 16, 17-month-old males, are really timid. They're trying this out. They're trying their life of crime, but they're not brazen yet. They're not brave. And you can look at this bear, you can see just someone saying boo, that bear's out of there. That's all it would take. These are not dangerous bears. They're not a health issue at all. So if you can identify it as a juvenile bear that's coming onto your property, into your yard, you can feel very confident taking control of the situation. Ben Killam, bear behavioralist out of Lyme, actually says, step out your door, look the bear right in the eye, and take several steps at it. He said it's the same thing another bear in bear society would do to let a bear know it's not wanted. and that's all it takes, and that bear will disappear out of there. I've told my supervisor that. He says, we can't be telling the public to go walk up the bears in the yard. But Ben has no compulsion about doing that, and he laughs at that. Next, please. We do have a management plan, and again, every 10 years we go to the public and ask, the big question is, how many bears do you want? Are you happy with the number you feel are in the state now, or would you like more, would you like less? At this time, we're told to stabilize the population about where it is now, and that's why we've lengthened the hunting season back to the days we reduced it in 20 years ago, and so we're trying to reduce slightly or keep the bear population where it is. Next, please. And our goal is to have wild bears that can live in the woods by themselves. They don't need any help from us, and they're a symbol of what's wild in the state, and we're all happy to have them here. We have a healthy, robust population of bears in the state. They should be here a lot. We've conserved a lot of land. We have a lot of public land in the state, and things look good for the future of bears. And hunting will continue. It's a tool that we use to actually keep the population of bears where it is. We feel that bears are one species that there isn't a biological carrying capacity. We're never going to reach that. It's a capacity of how many we want to allow. It's a behavioral capacity, and it's something less than the number that could be here. And again, it's all based on tolerance. How many bears will we tolerate? How well can we live with bears in our communities? And I get a lot of calls from actually different towns that are having problems with bears. Sometimes a town manager calls, will you come give a talk, just tell us what to do about our bears, how to live with the bears in our towns. And I'm always welcome to do that when I get those calls. And again, bird feeding, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, we promoted summer feeding of birds. We have apparently, from national surveys, the highest rate of bird watchers in the country. And to me, that means we've probably got the highest rate of bird feeders out there too. And so potential problems with bears. And so we feel it's just to be responsible. If you think there are bears in your neighborhood and there's high potential, please take down those feeders in the spring. And the birds don't need it. We really got it out there to see higher numbers of birds, right? So we ask you to do that. Next week. And people's tolerance of animals and how we treat them. And if people in Anchorage, Alaska can live with moose inside city limits, then we should be able to tolerate bears in our town and be able to live with them. Next, please. I gave a talk in Jamaica State Park. I really liked this. This was a number of years ago. And they had and I showed them by going to their dumpster and showing them the prints. In parks, whenever you camp, go to the dumpster. You can tell if they have bear problems or not. Because bears come in at night when there's dew on the grass and they cross gravel and then touch the dumpster and see what's there for food. You can always see whether or not bears are there and the size of the bear. And they called and said they were having some problems where I'd come give a presentation. I did. And I showed them the dumpster. I said, you've got an immature bear, a very small one coming in. Feel very comfortable trying to give it a negative experience. It wasn't a week later that the ranger sent me these photos. You can see this small bear behind there. Apparently there's a blueberry pie inside the tent. And the people called the ranger and the ranger rushed. Very innovative. The next slide, please. He grabbed a fire extinguisher and just walked right up to the bear and just sprayed it as he approached the bear. It didn't hurt the bear any. I don't think it even got any on it. But the bear was scared and it disappeared. They didn't have any more problems with it. I thought that was really cool that ranger did that next.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Where do I need to go?
Wow.
There.
Okay,
Sorry.
Next slide, please. Bears are actually vegetarians. They're classified as carnivores, but they're actually omnivores. They're very poor predators, so most of the year they're not eating meat. They love clover. And one thing that different sportsmen are doing now to increase the carrying capacity for wildlife on their properties is actually doing food plots and planting clover. They're usually doing it for deer, but if they're in a forested area, a lot of them are finding they have as many bears come in as deer. And Ben Killam actually feels that if you put one of those on your property, that often a female with cubs might get everything she needs from the clover, and it's enough to keep her from going downtown and getting into problems with garbage and things like that. And he actually has some food plots that he maintains just for the bears to do that. Yeah, next please. I encourage sportsmen, anybody who loves wildlife, one of the easiest things you can do is to go out where there are wild apple trees growing and just sunlight them. They need, of course, sunlight to produce the chlorophyll and everything to survive, for photosynthesis, and because they're short trees, other trees are always growing up and blocking out the sunlight, and then the apple trees die. They'll actually persist for, who knows, some of the apple trees have been here since some of our earliest colonists in the same area. They just grow new stems and grow from the same area. All they need is sunlight. And so I tell sportsmen especially, we've got a lot of volunteer groups that do this, that go out and simply cut the vegetation back from around apple trees to allow them sunlight. It's a wonderful, not just for bears, but for birds and just about every animal. The quote I like from one of our foresters is that things happen around apple trees in the woods. They really do. That's where you see a lot of wildlife, is around apple trees. Yeah. In our power lines, with very little timber cutting being done, in fact, the amount of early succession habitat in southern Vermont is really very little. And some of the brushy areas where there's largest amounts of raspberries and blackberries produced now, and even blueberries in southern Vermont, are along power lines. And when I talk to the people who maintain power lines, maintain them, and they fly with helicopters, they see dozens of bears. And it's wonderful habitat for bears and other species now. And again, I don't give a presentation that I don't talk about the value of logging for wildlife. There's certainly timber production can be done in a way that can actually hurt the forest. It can cause erosion, all kinds of things, but done especially using a forester who's trained to direct these and do it right, it can be the best thing for wildlife habitat, for getting a diversity of wildlife habitat. So, and unfortunately, I think our kids are growing up to think cutting trees is a bad thing. That's bad in itself. And we are working in a lot of the different organizations, like the Linking Lands Alliance, is trying to identify the corridors that wildlife needs so that they do not get blocked up in one area, and you see problems with genetics, and especially for animals that aren't good at crossing from one place to the next. This is being done on a national, international scale, as well as smaller areas as well, identifying the major core areas that the animals have to get to, and then just how they actually get to it. And what we find is, one thing is, you might have a forested block here, here, and here. The animals don't go in a straight line from there. They might zigzag back and forth wherever the vegetation is such, and the topography that's easiest for them to travel. And we can identify a lot of those sites, or prospective ones, just from aerial photography, but it takes groundwork with track counts and things like that. A lot of town conservation commissions and regional commissions are actually doing that kind of work with volunteers. And we also have research projects with GPS collars, with satellite collars and stuff on animals to help identify those. Yeah, and so there's a lot of ongoing work with this. Once we identify the sites, then we say, what are we going to do about it? How can we try to produce maps like these? And how can we actually protect those sites and perhaps conserve the most important ones? And we work with V-Trans as well, doing projects where we look at the major highways, like Route 9 through here, the red areas of where we have the highest potential for bear crossings, and where we've had bear crossings, we also have moose and fisher and bobcat crossings and things like that. And so with each of the major highways in the state now, we have most of those primary sites identified. And again, this will be used in the future when there are highway projects and things like that. One last thing I'd like to talk about is, over time, there's been a lot of tree species, mass species that have been important to bears that we've lost from disease and that type of thing. Climate change is a problem, and we're looking at how that's going to impact wildlife as well in the future. One bright spot, we think, is the work that's been going on with trying to restore the American chestnut. Climate change might actually help this, because probably the range of where you can grow chestnuts in the state is expanded north. We think that we can have certainly American chestnut restored everywhere where oak trees are grown in the state, and perhaps further north in a lot of those areas as well. I'm excited for bears and for other wildlife. The work that's been done with the American Chestnut Foundation is they think they produced a blight-resistant strain of American chestnut now, and what they want to do, next slide, is actually produce some seed orchards. The amount of mass produced by chestnuts, it's a more consistent mass producer than anything we've got in the state, partly because unlike oak and unlike beech, which pretty much produces every other year, maybe, American chestnut produces annually large amounts of nuts, and one way it does that is it flowers later than the other species, so it usually misses those late frosts. Next, please. And so we have an organization now. It's a fledgling organization. There's a Vermont, New Hampshire chapter, and they actually are doing volunteer projects. They still are doing some research orchards, working out the best strains. They're trying to work with the existing American chestnuts, which aren't blight resistant, but they still occur in some places in northern New England, and trying to cross those with the resistant ones that they have. But within the next 5 years or so, we hope to have the first seed orchards of the trees we desire to have going out in the woods and stuff, and to produce those. And I find that very exciting. I won't see a whole lot of that in my lifetime, but I know the work's going forward that we might restore this important food source for not just bears, but for so many other species out there as well. It's going to happen. Next, please. With that, yeah. Thank you very much.